So, like many people, I suppose since the pandemic began, Lori and I have found that our screen time has increased since we can't go out to a movie or to a play or for a while there even out to dinner or anything. We found that we spent more time in front of a TV screen. And worse than that, we don't have network television, so we have streaming services, which means we can watch entire seasons, the entire run of a TV show, by binge watching it just like nonstop. So, lately, we started watching a show that is, I think, a very meaningful representation of a people in the wilderness. A wilderness of their own making as it happens, but a group of people on a journey together who start out on that journey in a very structured, very hierarchical, very formalized way. And there is order, or else. And that gets turned on its head, and they have to figure out how to be in relationship with each other. All of them, because suddenly there's no hierarchy, there's no structure. They need to figure out how to create a community with relationship. If that sounds familiar, it immediately struck me as being very much like the story of the Hebrew people lost in the wilderness. That they are brought out of Egypt, freed from slavery, a very much law and order way of being, a very structured way of being, and then had to find a way to work together to create community amongst themselves. They needed to figure out how to have relationships with each other, and they needed help with that. I'll get to that in a second. But the show I'm talking about, oddly enough, tells that story in the context of what I think is probably the most absurd and preposterous storyline I've ever seen in science fiction. The show's called Snowpiercer, and it's great. You should watch it. I highly recommend it. But the idea is that in the future, we react to climate change by trying to seed the atmosphere, and instead what it does is create a giant ice age where the temperature of the planet drops to minus 140 degrees. But a remnant of humanity survives on a train. A train which has a perpetual motion engine and circumnavigates the globe on a track which somehow got built around the world. And so they don't have years, they have revolutions, right, of the planet. And of course it starts out with people who purchase tickets in first, second, and third class, but then there's the people who got on the train at the last minute, who snuck their way on. They live in the tail, the end of the train, which by the way is 1,001 cars long. And it's just, it's absurd. It's based on a graphic novel, by the way, for which there was also a movie version of this story. But the thing is, they don't focus on that. They don't explain the science, whatever that science might be, around any of that. What they focus on is the people on the train. This closed place where they have to figure out how to get along. And initially they do that by enforcing first, second, third class, and then the tailies, the ones who live in the tail, they get to stay on the train by doing the dirtiest of all the jobs. And then third class has to do various jobs. Second class has their own jobs. First class, of course, doesn't work. But it's very structured. And then it gets turned on its head because the tailies take over the train. And suddenly there is, and this is their slogan, one train. It goes on from there. There's more to it, obviously. But the reason I'm mentioning all of that is because Many of you will probably think, oh dear, Robin's talking about one of those shows we've never heard of and are likely to never see. And yes, I am. For those of you who have seen it or might now watch it, good on you. But the point is, I saw in that story a very biblical story being retold. And whether you've seen that, read the graphic novel, or even seen the movie, or seen the show, some have, and will now know that story. And this is the thing about the stories that we tell from the Bible. We keep telling these stories because at the heart of these stories is what is true. At the heart of these stories is a way for us to learn to be people together, a way for us to learn about love, a way for us to learn about how to build relationships with each other. Or it could also be used as a way to control everyone and keep them where they're supposed to be, in their particular, let's say, class on the train. But that's harder to do if we keep retelling these stories in a way that makes them instantly relevant and meaningful. And that's the thing about this story, and that's why I mention it, is because I could share with somebody who's watched this show that this is how I see it, and they could go, oh, really? Oh, okay. Because they didn't know the biblical story, but they do now know a story about people in the wilderness figuring out a way to get along together. Which is why I think it's so important to keep retelling these stories in a way that people can connect with right away, that they can find relevant right away. I think it's still important to tell these stories as they are and talk about their context, because we can learn from that too. In fact, here's a really important example. Letting the Ten Commandments stand alone by themselves, even calling them commandments, is not nearly as meaningful as helpful as understanding the context in which the Hebrew people found themselves. That sense of being lost and not knowing how to relate to each other. Because they never had to. They spent generations living in a way that was controlled, that had order or else. And now, they've got to figure out how to get along. Yes, they still need to have some order. I'm not saying they don't. But if we look at these 10, I can't keep calling them commandments. Because somebody in the Geneva Bible in the 16th century called them commandments. The King James Bible picked it up, and we've been calling them commandments ever since. Jews don't call them commandments. They're the 10 sayings. And here we are in the 21st century, still calling them commandments, with our 21st century understanding of what a command is. It's an order. We refer to them as law, with our 21st century understanding of what law is. And law isn't always about justice, is it? Sometimes it's about law. The point is, we understand differently in our 21st century context. And even taking that story of these people and putting it in, say, a ridiculous science fiction story in which they're stuck on a train in a post-apocalyptic future in which they can't leave the train because it's minus 140 degrees outside, we still have to figure out a way to understand this that's relevant and meaningful to us, that helps us understand, first of all, these are not commands. These are not orders. They're not rules that have a punishment attached to them. They are building blocks for relationship. And they begin, and here's the really important part that we need to remember about the context of all of this. they begin, I think, with the assumption on God's part that, well, not the assumption, the knowledge, the awareness, because it's God, that we are love. And we begin in love. And when we begin with the awareness that we are love, and look at these as, here's a few ideas, a few ways in which that love could be shared, and relationships could be built. And we could be one people, even though we are uniquely individual. That's different. That's very different. In fact, I think it's not just a question of trying to tell them in a way that's relevant to us now. It's also needing to take in consideration that, 8 out of the 10 are thou shalt not. As if it's easier to say what you shouldn't do than what you should. And it is easier to say what you shouldn't do than what you should. But it's not if you begin with love. If you begin with the understanding that we are love, that there's that divine spirit, that we are connected to God and the earth, we can also reframe these for our own context as things that we should do instead of the things that we shouldn't. There is one. I know you're waiting for me to say God. There is one. I'm going to say God, and you might say God, but other people might understand that differently. We might want to say how we understand God. God is love. There is one love. The energy, the spirit that is life, the power, the energy in the universe that creates, the higher power, the fabric of creation. Any of those ways that we want to express God, there is one, and we are a part of that. Whatever words, whatever language we use, there is one. And we should adore and devote ourselves to the oneness, to God. Things are just things. I know that goes without saying. People are just people. That also goes without saying. Why would we worship them? Only the one is what we should devote ourselves to, the one that we should adore, that we should celebrate with, and pray with, and connect with. And whatever language we use to describe, I'm going to say God, we should respect that. We actually sing at least one, if not many more, hymns that say, God knows you by name. Well, if God respects your name, you should respect God's name. In fact, you should take some time on a regular basis to do that, to connect with God, to reconnect with God often. You call it a Sabbath, if you wish, and please don't argue over which day it is. But take the time. A Sabbath isn't just a day off. It's a day that we put aside some of the other things, some of the more worldly things, in order that we might reconnect with however you know God. So take that time. Doesn't have to be Saturday, doesn't have to be Sunday. If you belong to a community that sets aside that time on a certain day, please do that. But remember that the point of it isn't a day off. It's a day on our relationship with God. We should honor our parents. We should. We should honor our parents. They gave us life. They were part of giving us life. We should honor our closest relations in particular, but we shouldn't stop there. In fact, we should honor all life, all of creation. We should honor it and protect it and keep it safe. Consider it what it is, sacred. We should not hurt it or destroy it or kill it. Of course not. We should honor it and respect it and care for it. Keep it safe and protect it. Not just our own, but all. And while we're on that, we should honor all our relationships, particularly our closest ones. We should honor our commitment to relationships. Sometimes that means that relationship might need to end. But it should end with respect and love. Sometimes it needs work because relationships are messy. Do it. Be messy. Get messy. Work on it. Honor the idea of relationship. And while we're on the idea of honoring, because let's face it, a lot of this is about that, we all have our own stuff. And it's hard often to see what other people have and not go, hey, I'd like that too, which is fine. But don't take it because it belongs to someone else, and you should respect what belongs to someone else, just as they should respect what belongs to you. And when we do that, we might also then celebrate the joy that someone else might find in what they have, just as we might find joy in celebrating what we have. I'm going to come back to that in a second, but since we're talking about that, be honest, be true. Not just in the telling of truth, but in the living of what is true, what is life-giving, what is creating, what is love. And be happy with what you have, because what you have is love. You don't need to worry about other people's things. It's kind of connected to the honor other people's things part. But you don't need to worry about that even. Because you should be happy with what you have, because what you have is love. What you have is what we all have. Love and grace and compassion. We have that in us. It all begins with that. It all begins with that, and how because it begins with that, we are all uniquely individual and yet part of the one. That's a starting point. It's not about 10 ways that you can adjust your behavior in order that we can all get along. It's about ways in which we can live out the love in relationship with God and with each other. That's what makes it a covenant, not commandments, not laws, but a covenant. That covenant begins with love. And truly, if we begin with love, we know then also that God lives these 10 sayings too. Because God is in us. And we can do this. We can live into. Are we going to be absolutely 100% perfect at it? Of course not. We learn that from Jesus. We're not going to be perfect at it. But we are going to be who we are. And we are going to build relationships with others in love. Imagine the world that would be created, the community that would be created, living into that love. There aren't words for that. We've tried to put all of these things in words. In fact, that's the storytelling part. But the story has to be able to speak to you. And sometimes it's great to read an old story, as long as we understand where it comes from, when it comes from, and what its context was. Sometimes we need it to speak to us now. We need it to be a story that we can relate to today. We need it to be words that will help us be the love that we are.